During the 70s, 80s and 90s, a serial killer committed numerous heinous crimes and managed to evade capture for nearly 3 decades. His ability to remain hidden from the police was remarkable, until out of pure greed, he made a false move that led to his downfall. In the early 2000s, after almost a decade without committing any crimes, his name had faded from the newspapers and people's memories. This made him feel uncomfortable, as he craved the notoriety he once had. And it was then he attempted to communicate with the police, believing that his outdated knowledge from the previous century would still protect him in the new millennium. This miscalculation proved to be his undoing. He would in fact have died without paying for any of his crimes, but his greed for recognition led to his capture. This case is quite detailed, and the fact that he was caught allows us to know many details that for decades were not even known to the police. Today's case, we will talk about the infamous serial killer behind the mask of evil, Dennis Rader, better known as BTK. Dennis Lynn Rader was born in Pittsburgh, Kansas, on March 9, 1945. His parents, William and Dorothea Cook Rader, were deeply religious and had conservative values rooted in faith and tradition with the local Lutheran church. Shortly after his birth, the Rader family moved to Wichita, also in Kansas, and there he would spend his entire childhood and youth. Neighbors described the Rader family as a close-knit, wholesome, loving family, active in the community, and Dennis was described as a quiet, intelligent, and reserved young boy. However, there was a hidden world behind Dennis's composed exterior. He displayed signs of unconventional behavior that may not have been noticed by those around him. He created an imaginary friend named Rex. He blamed Rex for the perverse thoughts for his increasingly dark thoughts. By the age of 9, Dennis had developed a deep interest with sadomasochistic photos encountered in magazines he had seen by chance. Unable to obtain such content directly due to his age, he reproduced those photographs by sketching disturbing images of naked, bound and gagged women. In his early adolescence, Dennis's inner world grew darker. As his sexuality blossomed, his desires intensified. He created mental images of women tied up, unable to escape. His predatory behavior included spying on his neighbors through the window and chasing random women down in public spaces and through supermarket aisles, envisioning twisted scenarios. In 1966, at 21, Dennis joined the US Air Force and served for 4 years. For obvious reasons, his dark fantasies were concealed during his military career. To channel his desires, he continued to make macabre drawings, each sketched and then destroyed to avoid exposure. During his military career, Dennis lived alone in a small house close to his parents. In August 1970, at 25, he was discharged from the army. He returned to Wichita, still clinging to his family's faith. He continued to be a member of the Lutheran Church of Christ. It was there later that year he met Paula Dietz, aged 22, a young, devout woman who worked as a secretary in a medical clinic and sang at the choir in church. After a brief courtship, Dennis and Paula got married on May 22, 1971. Now settled into married life, Dennis pursued a degree in electrical engineering and found work with an aircraft maintenance company. Wichita, the aviation hub of the US, offered plenty of opportunities, and Dennis found satisfaction in his role. He graduated in 1973, but a setback awaited him. He was suddenly fired, an unexplained dismissal that sparked frustration and a simmering anger. This rage became a catalyst, propelling him toward darker impulses, and this probably served as a trigger for him to commit his first real crime, burglary. Using techniques he had gleaned from true crime magazines, he broke into a random house in the early hours of the morning just for the pleasure of feeling capable of doing so. He wandered around the house for a short time and left without taking anything. Little did he know, this act would mark the beginning of a twisted path, one that would soon escalate to far graver offences in the following years. Dennis decided to enroll at Wichita State University, choosing criminology as a major. In the following months, he would experience some professional instability, oscillating between several small jobs. He continued to live an apparently normal life as a dedicated husband, an exemplary member of the community, an active and devoted member of the church, leader of the region's Boy Scouts group, longing to have children and a stable, well-paid job. However, beneath the respectable facade, he was shifting toward darker paths. Without a steady job, he became addicted to adult content. He spent a good part of the day immersed in violent criminal erotic fantasies, as his criminology classes became more than an academic pursuit. At 28 years old, Dennis was feeling empowered, trained to kill, and ready to act. He returned to the covert hunting habits of his youth. He would watch random women, trailing them as they shopped or walked in the streets, identifying those who captured his attention, noting their routines, addresses, and schedules. In his mind, each potential victim became a project, and he chose a specific name for each one, which were meticulously detailed and organized in a table written in a notebook that he kept hidden and locked in one of the drawers of his closet. In December 1973, Dennis was driving with his wife beside him when he noticed a station wagon reversing down the street. Inside the vehicle was a mother and her daughter. He was especially drawn to the girl, due to her Hispanic origin. After dropping his wife at work, he returned home, but couldn't get the image of the brunette girl with long dark hair and glasses out of his mind. Driven by a compulsion he barely understood, he took out his notebook and started a new project. Project Little Mex. Mex referred to the girl's Mexican appearance. But who was the little Mexican girl that he planned to victimize? And why had she caught his eye? Josephine Otero, 11 years old, was the fourth daughter of Joseph and Julie Otero. In fact, the family was Puerto Rican, and Josie had 4 siblings in total. The 3 oldest were Charlie, aged 15, Danny, 14 years old, and Carmen, 13 years old, and the youngest brother, Joseph Jr., 9 years old. They had only moved to Wichita 10 days ago and were still settling into their new home. They had moved from New Jersey in search of better job opportunities for their father, a retired sergeant with 20 years of service in the technical field of the US Air Force. After spotting Josie and Julie on the street, Dennis became consumed by what he named Project Little Mex. Over the following weeks, he meticulously tracked the family's routine. He knew when the father left for work in his sedan, the exact moment the mother drove the station wagon to take Josie and Joseph Jr. to school, and every detail of their daily comings and goings. Dennis recorded all this information, crafting a detailed plan. On Tuesday, January 15, 1974, a snowy winter morning, Dennis left home at around 8 a.m., drove to the parking lot of a shopping centre where he left his car and then stole another vehicle. He wore a large Parker-style coat with a fur-lined hood to block the wind, and in that coat he hid the items he would use: 2 pistols, 2 knives, ropes, duct tape, and plastic bags. At 8:20 in the morning, Dennis positioned himself near the Otero house. He knew that the father, Joseph, had likely left for work at 8 a.m., taking the 3 older children to school, and that Julie would take the 2 younger children, Josie and Joey Jr., at 8:45 a.m. This narrow window was all the time he needed for his act. Josie was his primary target, but he knew he would also have to deal with Josie and Joey Jr. as collateral damage. What he didn't know was that Joseph had crashed his car over the weekend, and due to the accident, he was temporarily away from work. Approaching the house, Dennis noticed the garage door was open and found it strange since it was always closed. Dog tracks in the snow in the backyard also caught his attention. In fact, he had never looked over the backyard gate and therefore didn't know that Otero had a dog. Despite these surprises, he was committed to following through. With his hunting knife in hand, Dennis cut the telephone line. Suddenly, he heard the back door open and saw little Joey Jr. going out, the family dog barking furiously beside him. Dennis stepped forward, pointing the knife at Joey's face to silence him, ushering him firmly toward the kitchen. So far so good, everything was part of the plan. But when Dennis arrived in the kitchen, he was surprised by the presence of his father, sitting at the table with his cup of coffee. Even with that unexpected fact, he kept his composure and followed through with the plan. He said, "I'm a robber on the run from the police. You don't need to be afraid. I won't hurt you. I just need money. If you cooperate, nothing bad will happen." Dennis ordered the 4 family members to lie down on the floor. Using his ropes and duct tape, he first tied up his father's arms and feet, considering him this greatest threat. Then he did the same with the mother and 2 children. He led them all to the couple's bedroom. What happened inside the room, as in other rooms in the house, was a series of crimes that do not deserve to be narrated here. What I can say is that he victimized everyone, using suffocation techniques, and with Josie he put into practice part of his desires that haunted him throughout his adolescence and adulthood. Before leaving, Dennis scoured each room, searching for items to take as grim trophies. He removed a small radio and slid Joseph's watch onto his wrist. He then climbed into Julie's car, driving it a short distance away with his hood pulled up to obscure his face. He adjusted the seat to conceal his height and parked on a quiet corner, before calmly making his way back to his own car. At 3:30 p.m, the older siblings Carmen and Danny returned from school, and they were the ones who came across that horrible scene. In desperation, they ran to their neighbors to ask for help. Difficult police work would begin in the search for the Otero's killer. Over 70 agents, including detectives, forensic specialists, criminal experts, were assigned to investigate the case. They worked tirelessly for long hours and several days in a row, but as weeks passed, the police had nothing to help elucidate the case or identify the killer. Dennis and Paula continued to attend church regularly, and he became an increasingly important member of the congregation. He was entrusted with leading the youth group and organizing church events. But while he presented himself as a devoted church leader, Dennis was nurturing a much darker side. In the basement of his house, he kept his trophies carefully hidden, and he began to spend hours alone there, consumed by his growing impulses. The monster within, or as he called it, the X Factor, a sinister evolution of his imaginary friend Rex, was urging him to act, to let his darkest side dominate. On February 3rd, 1974, Dennis completed his vast record of texts and illustrations about the execution of the Project Little Mex and filed it in a binder. He signed the document with the acronym BTK, which stood for Bind, Torture, Kill. When he committed more crimes and gained notoriety for them, this would be his signature, the name he wanted to be known as the BTK Killer. For weeks, BTK prowled his town, observing women who caught his interest. He kept notes on their routines, cataloguing every detail of their daily lives, weighing which ones would be easiest to capture. He eliminated those who seemed too risky, narrowing his list to a single target he dubbed Project Blackout. Catherine Bright was a young blonde, 21 years old, single, with a stable job and active in her faith. BTK had first spotted her in March 1974, when he was taking his wife to lunch at a restaurant. Catherine was outside her house picking up her mail, and her solitude caught his attention. Over the following weeks, he stalked her from a distance, learning her habits and daily schedule. She lived alone, without a partner, children, or even a dog to complicate things. Her routine was predictable. Dennis felt confident that he could carry out this plan without a hitch. But things wouldn't go exactly as he planned. On April 4th, 1974, BTK went to Catherine's house wearing college student-style clothes with some books on his arm. He believed this appearance would make him less suspicious to Catherine and her neighbours. His plan was to knock on the door and introduce himself as a student looking for a room to rent, and before she could resist, he would force his way inside. It turns out that, unlike what he had planned, she was not at home at that time, and so no one answered the door. BTK even tried to open it by force, but it was locked. Undeterred, he then went to the back door and found that it was also locked. Frustrated, he ended up acting on impulse, breaking the glass and reaching for the door handle from the inside. He entered the house and picked up the scattered pieces of glass. When Catherine arrived, she could see them on the floor and, realizing the threat, could run away. He hid in one of the bedrooms and then heard the front door open. Then, another setback. Catherine wasn't alone. She entered the house with a young man, laughing and talking. Dennis broke out in a cold sweat as he hastily adjusted his plan. Moments later, he stepped into the living room, gun in hand, facing the startled pair. Calmly, he told them not to be afraid, that he was a fugitive, on the run from California, where posters of his face were posted everywhere. He explained that he just needed a car and some money to escape to New York, and that he didn't want to hurt them if they cooperated. To make his story more convincing, he insisted on tying them up for safety. At that moment, BTK realized that he had made another mistake. He had not brought any bindings with him to tie up his victim. He had assumed Catherine would be alone, and it would be easy to control her. He intended to use a pantyhose or another item from her belongings to restrain her. Despite this setback, he led Catherine and her companion Kevin, who was actually her brother, into the bedroom at gunpoint. As they stood there, he rifled through her dresser, searching for anything he could use to tie them up. Turning to Kevin, he tossed him a bandana. "Tie her hands. Tight," he instructed. When Kevin finished, BTK ordered him to lie on the floor so he could secure him as well. In fact, he intended to take the lives of each of them in separate rooms, eliminating Kevin first, so that Catherine couldn't notice and wouldn't try to react. Wrapping a nylon stocking around Kevin's neck, he began to strangle him, but things quickly spiraled out of control. Kevin fought back, managing to break free. Startled, BTK reacted instinctively, pulling out his gun and firing twice at close range. Kevin collapsed, and BTK, heart pounding, rushed to Catherine's room. Catherine was in a state of pure panic, screaming and struggling. BTK wrapped a cloth around her neck, attempting to strangle her, but it was taking longer than he had expected. Frustrated and increasingly desperate to end everything quickly, he drew his knife and began to stab her repeatedly. At that same moment, BTK heard a noise coming from the hallway. He hurried to check and saw that the front door was wide open. He ran out of the house, not realizing that he had stains on his clothes and shoes, and that someone could see him like that. From afar, he saw Kevin running up the street and calling for help. BTK hurried several blocks to his car, parked inconspicuously nearby. He drove straight to his parents' house and headed for the tool shed in the backyard. There, he stashed his weapon in an old wooden box and peeled off his bloodied clothes and shoes, hiding them in the chicken coop, intending to burn them later. After cleaning up, he returned home, where his unsuspecting wife awaited him. He tried to act naturally, as if nothing had happened, but he was very distressed. He was certain that he'd left too many clues, and that his capture was imminent. And worse, he was not satisfied with the crime he committed. He didn't like the way everything was handled. Furthermore, he was unable to do everything he had planned in the Project Blackout. Meanwhile, Kevin, bleeding and frantic, ran to the corner of his sister's street and banged on a random neighbor's door, pleading for help in total despair. Officers arrived at Catherine's house within minutes. Paramedics quickly moved her to an ambulance, rushing her to the hospital. Though Catherine was still breathing, her injuries were severe, and despite the best efforts of the medical staff, she tragically passed away just hours after being rescued. Kevin was taken to the hospital as well. Fortunately, his injuries were not life-threatening, though he was initially unable to provide much information. It was only a few days later, as he recovered, that he could give police a detailed description of the attacker. He described the man as tall, around 6 feet, possibly weighing 80 kilos, and appearing to be about 28 years old. His skin was light, with a moustache, dark hair, and he wore gloves, a parka, and a military-style coat. Kevin also noted a silver watch with an adjustable bracelet and a black and yellow cap, similar to those worn by Wichita State University students. A sketch was produced and circulated in the newspaper, but it did not make any effective contribution to the investigation. Regarding the lines of investigation followed by the police, there was an internal disagreement between the agents responsible. The short time interval between the Otero family murders and Catherine's made a few detectives suspect a connection between the crimes. However, there were substantial differences in the methods adopted in each event. The Oteros had been asphyxiated, while Catherine had been asphyxiated, shot and stabbed. The phone line at the Otero house had been cut. Catherine's remained intact. In the Otero house, there were no signs of confrontation or resistance, and Catherine's house bore evidence of a violent altercation with overturned furniture. These differences convinced some officers that the crimes were not related and disassociated the cases. Meanwhile, BTK was closely following the news, his attention fixed on the unfolding investigation. Each day, he scanned television broadcasts and newspapers, waiting to see if detectives would close in on him. But as days turned into weeks with no progress, his nerves gave way to a twisted sense of relief and pride. Confident that he had outwitted them, he began compiling yet another meticulous report on his recent crime. He clipped Catherine's photo from the paper, adding it alongside other news articles to his records. Despite his sense of accomplishment, BTK was restless. The thrill of his work wasn't enough. He craved recognition, the same infamous status enjoyed by other killers of his time. Richard Speck, responsible for the brutal murders of 8 nurses in Chicago, and John Wayne Gacy, the notorious killer clown, had captured the nation's attention. BTK wanted people to know that he was out there too, a new kind of predator, with a method all his own, confident that his intellect and meticulous planning made him untouchable. In October 1974, 6 months after the execution of Project Blackout, the Wichita Eagle published an article revealing that 3 prisoners who were serving sentences for unrelated crimes were claiming to know details about the Otero murders. The 3 loudmouths insinuated that they knew who was responsible for the murders. The article even suggested that one of the 3 might be responsible, casting a shadow over BTK's carefully crafted identity. Upon reading the report, BTK was furious. How dare anyone take credit for his work? A few days later, the journalist who wrote the article received a phone call. Pay close attention to what I'm going to say. There is a letter about the Otero case inside a book in the public library. Write down the name of the book. BTK said the name of the book and hung up without saying anything else. The journalist contacted the police immediately. Police officers sent to the library found the letter and took it to the lead detective in the investigation. The text contained many grammatical errors, raising doubts as to whether the author of the letter had low education or whether he simply intended to mislead the police with intentional errors. I write this letter to you for the sake of the taxpayer as well as your time. Those 3 dudes you have in custody are just talking to get publicity for the Otero murders. They know nothing at all. I did it by myself and with no one's help. There has been no talk either. Let's put this straight. The letter precisely detailed the positions of the 4 victims' bodies, the colours of the clothes they were wearing, the types of ropes and threads used, as well as the types of knots that bound them. It was very specific information that only the police and the killer could know. BTK also described in great detail the cruelty of his actions. And he finished, I'm sorry this happened to society. They are the ones who suffer the most. It's hard to control myself. You probably call me psychotic with sexual perversion hang-up. When this monster enter my brain, I will never know. But it here to stay. How does one cure himself? If you ask for help that you have killed 4 people, they will laugh or hit the panic button and call the cops. I can't stop it, so the monster goes on and hurt me as well as society. Society can be thankful that there are ways for people like me to relieve myself at time by daydreams of some victims being torture and being mine. It a big complicated game my friend of the monster play, putting victims number down, follow them, checking up on them, waiting in the dark, waiting. The pressure is great and sometimes he run the game to his liking. Maybe you can stop him. I can't. He has already chosen his next victim or victims. I don't who they are yet. The next day after I read the paper, I will know. But it too late. Good luck hunting. P.S. Since sex criminals do not change their MO, or by nature cannot do so, I will not change mine. The code words for me will be bind them, torture them, kill them, BTK. You see he at it again. They will be on the next victim. The detectives, concerned about public panic, persuaded the editors of the Eagle to withhold any details about the new developments in the Otero case. But on Halloween morning, the newspaper defied this request, running a discreet column that would mark a chilling milestone in Wichita's history. For the first time, the name BTK appeared in print, not as a suspect, but as an anonymous informant. The column didn't reveal the meaning behind the acronym, but it hinted at a disturbing connection. Over the past week, Wichita police have been trying to reach a man who has information regarding the Otero murders. There is indeed a BTK. Police authorities cannot reveal how this is known, but they are convinced that whoever this BTK is has important information about the case. We are publishing a telephone number here so that BTK can make direct contact, and we are prepared to assist him. However, BTK did not make any contact. Just days before the article's publication, Dennis had started a new job with a security company installing home alarms, a business that had surged in demand following the recent murders. Ironically, the man terrorizing Wichita was now stepping into the homes of anxious families to install systems meant to keep them safe. In the 2 years following Catherine Bright's murder, Wichita heard nothing more from BTK. Meanwhile, Dennis Rader settled back into his role as the perfect citizen, a hard-working, religious and dedicated leader of the Boy Scouts. On July 27, 1975, he became a father for the first time with the birth of his son, Brian, adding yet another layer to his outwardly exemplary life. Even with his new family and work responsibilities, Dennis never stopped his dark pastime, his fishing, as he called it, the search for potential victims. He had learned from his past crimes, refining his strategy. Now, he always identified 2 or 3 alternative projects for any given day, in case his primary target slipped away. In early 1977, Dennis felt the old urge again. He had been preparing meticulously and finally felt ready to act. On March 17th, almost 3 years after his last crime, he left his home, dressed sharply and carrying an executive briefcase packed with the tools he'd need to execute his new project. Project Green. While walking towards the new target, BTK saw a boy walking alone on the street with a can of soup in his hands. He thought he was easy to prey. He decided to approach him. Pulling a photo from his suitcase, he approached the child and asked for help to find those people in the picture. The boy shook his head and, uninterested, continued on his way, entering a house just a few doors down from the home of Cindy, BTK's intended target that day. BTK watched him from a distance, considering whether he should abandon his original plan to pursue this new, more accessible option. Steve, the boy, who was 6 years old, had gone to the market at the request of his mother, Shirley Vian, a single mother with 3 children at home. She had a bad cold and was in bed, and his siblings, Bud, 8, and Stephanie, 4, also had the flu. When the children started feeling hungry, Shirley had called the nearby grocery store, asking them to expect Steve, who went to pick up soup for the family. About 15 minutes after Steve returned, the family heard a knock at the door. He ran over and opened it just a crack, but he could easily recognize the person outside, the man with the suitcase. Shirley put on a robe and got up to check. As she opened the door, BTK hurried to enter the house, showing a fake business card where he introduced himself as a detective. He closed the door calmly, while Shirley stood there, unresponsive. He drew his gun. He closed the living room curtains, turned off the TV, and approached the woman. With Shirley Vian and her children, BTK took a different approach. He locked the children in the bathroom while he acted out his dark impulses on Shirley. He once again put into practice actions of his X Factor, actions similar to what happened in the Otero house, and to his darkest desires that had accompanied him for years. In the end, he took 2 of her panties as a trophy and left. The kids managed to escape from the bathroom by breaking the window, but when they reached their mother's room, they saw a horrible scene. They asked a neighbor for help, and the police were quickly called. When paramedics and officers arrived, Shirley was already lifeless. The crime scene had all the hallmarks of BTK's work: intricate knots, expertly tied bindings, various types of ropes, a calculated brutality that mirrored the Otero murders. However, linking Shirley's murder to BTK would mean accepting that they were dealing with a serial killer. Shirley's children tried to help the police with describing the killer's physical characteristics, but their accounts varied. No fingerprints were found at the crime scene either. More than 50 neighbors were questioned, but there were no eyewitnesses or substantial clues. BTK's original plan, Project Green, which had targeted a woman named Cindy, was abandoned in favor of this sudden opportunity, and he felt a twisted pride in his spontaneous decision. Months passed and his confidence grew, as did his need to strike again. His next victim had already been chosen: Project Foxtail, named for her striking half-blonde, half-red hair. Coincidentally, her last name was Fox, a detail that made her seem destined for his fixation. Nancy Fox was a 25-year-old woman born and raised in Wichita. She was independent, self-confident, and very friendly. She worked as a secretary full-time and got an extra night job at Christmas time at a jewelry store. She played the flute and sang in the church choir. She lived alone, with no pets and no boyfriend. BTK had spotted her once when she was entering the house. She was his perfect target, and that pleased him. On December 8th, 1977, 9 months after Shirley Vian's murder, BTK approached the back of Nancy Fox's house under cover of darkness. He cut the phone line, smashed a window, and slipped inside, waiting for his next victim. When Nancy entered through the front door, she immediately sensed the intruder. She spotted him and without hesitation shouted for him to leave or she would call the police. But BTK stepped forward, revealing his gun. BTK took her purse and spread the contents on the table, while picking some trophies to take with him, such as her driver's license and other personal items. He told a very similar story to the one he told in previous crimes. He was a fugitive from the police. He just wanted sex, get money, and leave. However, Nancy surprised him, saying something like, "Let's get this over with so you can leave, and I can call the police." With no children involved in Project Foxtail, I'm going to briefly describe what happened inside, and you can keep in mind that what happened here was very similar to what happened to Josie Otero, the main victim of his first crime, Project Little Mex. BTK pulled Nancy's hands back and cuffed them. He laid her face down on her bed, gagged her, and took off her clothes. Then he took off his own leather belt and looped it around Nancy's neck, pulling it tight. A few minutes of despair would pass before she finally passed out. BTK released the belt and let her catch her breath. Moments later, when she regained consciousness, he whispered in her ear, "I am the serial killer the police are looking for. I was the one who killed the 4 people from the Otero family, Catherine Bright and Shirley Vian. You're next. I'm BTK." Finally, BTK tightened the belt once more, this time ending Nancy's life. He then took a blue nightgown, masturbated onto it, and left it beside her head as a twisted mark of his presence. From her dresser, he stole a few pieces of jewelry and high-quality lingerie, trophies he'd later savor in private. As he knew it could be a while before Nancy's body was found, and he wanted to once again make headlines, he was not willing to wait. From a payphone, BTK made a call. At 8:18 a.m., the emergency centre received a call from a man who reported that there had been a homicide, saying the location and name of the victim. The attendant tried to ask more questions, but he had already put the phone down and left. The police arrived at Nancy's house a few minutes later. There they found that sad and grim scene, as well as the evidence of semen on the nightgown. The details were chillingly familiar, and investigators felt a reluctant certainty BTK had returned. In the following weeks, as police pored over evidence, BTK revelled his own sense of invincibility. He had called in his own crime, providing a traceable recording of his voice, yet he remained out of reach. Confident in his methods, he continued compiling his meticulous dossiers, savouring the thought that one day the world would finally know who he was. Almost 2 months had passed since Nancy's death, and the lack of publicity about the case was beginning to bother BTK. He then decided to communicate with the press again. He took a poem he had written about Shirley Vian and reproduced it on a note card, using children's stamps with the letters of the alphabet. On January 31st, 1978, BTK mailed the poem to the Wichita Eagle newspaper. They received it a day later. Shirley Locks, will you be mine? You will not scream, nor will you free yourself from the thread. You will lie on pillows thinking about me and death, then how it's going to be. BTK. The poem was based on the nursery rhyme Curly Locks. The staff handling mail at the Wichita Eagle didn't think much of the letter they'd received. With Valentine's Day approaching, they assumed it was some quirky submission intended for the newspaper's special classified section. However, since no payment accompanied the letter, it was disregarded and sent to the archive. Days passed, and BTK's poem went unpublished, and that left him extremely furious. 10 days later, February 10th, the local ABC-affiliated station KK-TV received an unmarked envelope with very disturbing contents. A poem titled, "Oh, Death to Nancy," signed BTK 4 times. Next to each signature was a small drawing of a gallows. Behind the poem, a 2-page typewritten letter with hundreds of words full of spelling errors, and a pencil drawing of a bound and gagged woman. I think it wasn't fair that the newspaper didn't publish about Shirley Vian's poem. A short paragraph would have been enough. I know it's not the press's fault. The police chief is the one who keeps everything secret and doesn't want the public to know that there is a serial killer out there. There are 7 people underground, and there will be more. How many will I have to kill before I get my name in the paper and get some national attention? I'll make sure there's no doubt. I will leave a note with the letters BTK on the next victim. Alarmed, the Cake TV executive producer immediately contacted the Wichita Police Department and met with the new police chief. Together, they decided to air a report on BTK that same evening, scheduling a live, exclusive interview with the police chief during the 6 p.m. news broadcast. That news dropped like a bomb among the city's 200,000 residents. There was no talk of anything else. The population, alarmed and insecure, drastically changed their habits and routines. For BTK, the news was a source of glory and ecstasy. While the population lived in anguish and fear, the BTK continued its normal life peacefully. Kerry, the couple's youngest daughter, was born in June 1978. BTK, who was still just Dennis to friends and family, graduated in 1979, and with the knowledge he acquired about investigation procedures and forensic practices, he was feeling even more prepared and more untouchable than ever. What I'm going to say now may seem like an exaggeration, but it isn't. The scale of the investigation was enormous. By then, hundreds of people had been interviewed, thousands of work hours logged, and a mountain of case reports accumulated. Police had poured hundreds of thousands of dollars into the investigation, yet the frustration among investigators only fueled BTK's pride, as he continued to elude capture. So, you may have already noticed that BTK acts in a very different way from the other serial killers we know. His crimes had long gaps. The Otero family and Catherine was in 74, Shirley and Nancy in 77. Dennis didn't know when BTK would be back in action. It could be the following year or a few years later. And it turned out that he would vanish for 7 years before resurfacing in 1985, crueler than ever. From 1978 through the end of 1984, the BTK case lay dormant, with no new developments. Dennis Rader found a way to temporarily quell his urges by staging scenes of submission in private. He would dress in his victims' clothing, wearing wigs and masks, and tie ropes or wires to his own body. With a camera set on a tripod and a remote control in hand, he took self-portraits in submissive poses, reliving aspects of his fantasies. These rituals provided a temporary release and helped him resist the urge to harm others. Yet deep down, they only intensified his craving to relive the power and thrill that he could only achieve with a real victim. By this time, BTK had been promoted to supervisor position at the security facilities company, which meant he had to travel to other cities across Kansas. On these trips, he spent the night alone in motels and had the privacy he needed to carry out his disturbing rituals. In 1984, the Otero murders had been unsolved for 10 years, and BTK had not spoken out again since June 1979, when he sent the last letter to Anna and Keiki TV. The case seemed to have gone cold, but Wichita police never closed it for good. With the support of the City Hall, the police chief set up a specialized task force to try to reignite the investigation into the BTK case. He brought together a group of veteran and rookie detectives, as well as FBI behavioral experts. The task force was nicknamed Ghostbusters, reflecting the belief that BTK might have died given the absence of leads since, and with so many years without clues. Tens of thousands of pages of documents were organized, and their data was transferred to computer systems for analysis. Then, in early 1985, BTK was driving through his Park City neighborhood when he noticed his neighbor, Maureen Hedge. Her house was just meters from his own. They exchanged waves as usual, but that moment ignited a powerful, dark impulse within him. He imagined suffocating her. The thought filled him with a disturbing mix of heat and pleasure, a sensation he hadn't experienced in years. Maureen was a 53-year-old widow, small, thin, and very elegant. She lived alone, worked afternoon and night shifts at a coffee shop, and was very dedicated to her children and grandchildren. She was a sociable person and liked to have fun with her friends at bingo and church. From the moment he imagined himself attacking his neighbor, BTK couldn't get that idea out of his head. He knew that his inner monster had awakened and that he would not be able to control it. Targeting a neighbor so close to his family was very risky, but having a project on his own street was, in a way, convenient. He already knew most of Maureen's routines and schedule, and it would be easier for him to observe her from the comfort of his own house. In honor of Maureen's reputation as a good baker in the neighborhood, BTK named her Project Cookie. On April 26th and 27th, 1985, BTK and his son would be camping 30 kilometers from his home, so the date of the attack was set. BTK knew he would need a very solid alibi for his next attack. All that was needed was to finalize the details of the project, because Factor X, his evil desire, was already more voracious than ever. On the 26th, father and son arrived at the campsite, setting up their tents and joining other parents and children around the campfire. Shortly after dark, Dennis feigned a headache, excusing himself to bed early and asking the group to look after his son. Meanwhile, on a road 5 kilometers from the campsite, he had pre-stashed a bowling bag containing his attack kit. He drove a few more kilometers towards the biggest bowling alley in the region, parked his car, bought a beer, spilled some of it all over his body, and pretended to be drunk. After that, he took a taxi towards his target, asking the driver to drop him off at a certain location where he pretended it was his house. But in reality, that location was just 2 blocks from Marine's house. BTK cut the telephone line and carefully opened the door with a screwdriver, avoiding any noise as much as possible. She was already falling asleep when BTK jumped on top of her and started suffocating her with his bare hands. After she passed out for the first time, he wrapped pantyhose around her neck and waited. As soon as she regained her senses, he started pulling the sock hard, making her choke until he was sure she was dead. This time, BTK wanted to try something new. For the first time, he moved the body from the crime scene. He undressed Marine completely, wrapped her body in a blanket, and dragged it to the trunk of her car. As a congregation leader at Christ Lutheran Church, it was the ideal place to have the privacy and security he needed. He took the victim to one of the church's halls and began to prepare her for a photo shoot in masochistic scenes. Once he was finished, he drove to a secluded wooded area near the church and disposed of Marine's body. He abandoned her car nearby and returned to his own vehicle, heading back toward the scout camp. Dawn was breaking when he quietly slipped back into his tent, emerging shortly after with the other campers as if he'd slept through the night. When asked, he said he was feeling better, and the day unfolded as if nothing had happened. On April 28th, Wichita police were alerted to Marine's disappearance after she missed 2 days and was unreachable. A few days later, her car was located, but without any traces or clues to help find her. The body was only found 9 days after the murder, already in an advanced stage of decomposition, which would end up making the necropsy and determination of the cause of death difficult. However, an alarming detail stood out to the investigators. Near the victim's naked body, there was a nylon pantyhose with several knots. This finding, coupled with investigators already discovering that the telephone cable at Marine's residence had been cut, led some detectives to suspect that BTK was active again. There were several discrepancies between Marine's murder and BTK's typical modus operandi. For one, over 7 years had passed since his last known killing, and BTK hadn't communicated with anyone in more than 5 years. Moreover, BTK's previous murders had always taken place within the victim's home. He had never removed a body from the scene, leaving investigators uncertain whether Marine had even been killed inside her home. Most notably, BTK didn't take credit for this crime. His narcissistic personality and established need for recognition made it uncharacteristic for him to stay silent. For the Wichita police, these factors were enough to exclude him as a suspect. What they didn't realize, however, was that BTK had a very good reason. To avoid drawing attention this time, the last thing he wanted was police scouring his own neighborhood looking for him. The photos of Marine's submission kept him entertained and distracted for some time. But another potential victim soon reawakened his inner monster, pushing him to focus on a new project. In August 1986, BTK spotted a young woman getting into her car. Vicki Wegerle was 28, blonde, married, and a mother of 2. She spent most days at home with her 2-year-old son, Brandon, while her daughter Stephanie was at school and her husband Bill was at work. Vicki was a quiet and religious woman. She played the piano perfectly, and sometimes while BTK was spying on her outside her house, he ended up getting distracted listening to her play and lost time. In reference to his musical talent, BTK named it Project Piano, and for this project, he wanted to try a new approach. On the morning of September 16th, BTK arrived at the street where Vicki lived, characterized as a maintenance technician for the telephone company. He wore a yellow helmet, a fake identification badge, and a tool bag. He easily gained her trust, and she let him in. BTK took some tools out of his briefcase and pretended to use the device, while striking up a conversation with Vicki and looking around, to confirm that she was really alone. He found that only the 2-year-old baby was there, playing in the playpen. He finished his simulation, saying that everything appeared fine. He opened the briefcase to store the tools when at the same time, he suddenly took out his gun and pointed it at Vicki. He ordered her to lie down on the bed, and he tied her wrists and ankles with leather laces. Vicki began to cry and pray out loud. Merciless, BTK slapped and punched the woman in the face, and when she began to faint, he placed his hands on her throat, squeezing violently. She choked and struggled, trying to resist, but she quickly succumbed. Afterward, he took out his Polaroid camera, arranging Vicki's body in obscene poses, lifting her blouse to expose her chest, and taking several photos. These images would later serve as material for his fantasies. He left Vicki's body on the floor between the bed and TV stand, rifled through her purse to take her driver's license as a trophy, then drove off in her car. Parking it a few blocks away, he disposed of his disguise in a dumpster, then calmly walked back to his own vehicle. BTK had claimed his 9th victim, and once again, no one suspected a thing. When Bill arrived home for lunch, the first thing he noticed was that his wife's car was missing. Entering the house, he found his young son awake, alone, and crying. Cradling the child in his arms, Bill tried to reassure himself, thinking Vicki might have stepped out briefly for something urgent and would return soon. Uneasy, he paced around the house with his son, making himself a sandwich to calm his nerves. But as 45 minutes passed without any sign of Vicki, worry began to consume him. Just before leaving to return to work, he decided to search around the house one last time. Entering the bedroom and moving closer to the bed, he made a devastating discovery. His wife's lifeless body lay on the floor beside the bed. Overcome with despair, Bill frantically called emergency services. Rescuers found Bill in tears, punching the wall of the house. Vicki was already dead, with marks of suffocation and beatings. Police officers arrived at Vicki's house and began questioning Bill on site. The man was very shaken, but tried to cooperate, answering questions with his son on his lap. In cases like this, where a wife is killed in the house, inevitably the first suspicion falls first on the husband. Bill was taken to the police station, where investigators subjected him to an intense and accusatory interrogation, appearing more focused on confirming his guilt than uncovering the truth. They attempted to trip him up with leading questions and cast doubt on his account, even suggesting a polygraph test, which Bill readily agreed to, confident in his innocence. The following day, the autopsy confirmed that Vicki had died from suffocation and revealed the presence of semen. Beneath one of her fingernails was a fragment of the attacker's skin, torn during her attempt to fight him off. While DNA testing was still an emerging science, this evidence held promise for future investigation and was carefully preserved. Vicki's murder sparked widespread shock and intense media coverage in Wichita. Public speculation quickly grew. Some questioned whether Bill could be the culprit, while a few articles dared to wonder if the notorious BTK killer could be involved. However, without concrete evidence, police were hesitant to make that connection. The following year, in 1987, the task force created to investigate the BTK crimes, nicknamed Ghostbusters, was disbanded, having been unsuccessful in its mission. Despite the disappointment felt by its members and the pressure from the public and media, the task force left behind a critical legacy: 37 meticulously organized boxes of documents, reports, and evidence, along with thousands of data points entered into early computer programs. Genetic science was still developing, but they had collected 3 DNA samples from BTK crime scenes. This material would undoubtedly serve as a foundation for future investigations. Meanwhile, Dennis Rader, the upstanding citizen behind the BTK persona, continued his life unscathed. At over 40 years old, he no longer had the same motivation, energy, or drive to chase women down the street. Instead, he began to collect photos of models that he cut out of magazines and drew restraints, gags, and bizarre details on them. He kept them with him in the car, as if he were taking them for a ride. He continued to carry out his autoerotic rituals, using the victim's clothes and accessories, and these activities were enough for him for another almost 5 years. But by 1991, his internal monster, the X Factor, emerged again. In January 1991, BTK was out on one of his drives when he noticed an elegant woman walking nearby. Dolores Davis. She lived close to the border between Park City and Wichita, in a neighborhood not far from Rader's own home. Dolores was 62, a recently retired executive secretary who had dedicated over 25 years to the same company. Vain yet kind-hearted, she was a Mary Kay saleswoman and an advocate for animal welfare. With a kennel near her house, BTK named his twisted plan Project Dogside. For several nights, he watched Dolores' steps and habits. He defined his plan of attack, in which he would again use the scouting event as an alibi. On January 18th, around 10:30 p.m., Rader was lurking in Dolores' backyard. Through her window, he saw her alone in bed, reading. Without hesitation, he hurled a concrete block through her sliding glass door. Dolores rushed into the living room, freezing at the sight of the intruder. BTK pointed his gun at her and ordered her back to the bedroom. The outcome was as grimly predictable as it was horrifying. After rummaging through drawers and closets and stealing souvenirs from the victim, BTK dragged Dolores' body using the bedsheet and placed it in the trunk of her car. He got rid of the woman's body, throwing it from a low bridge into a thicket. Before leaving, he went down and took a few photos of her body, making use of a special accessory that he loved to use on himself, a plastic mask, on which he himself had painted eyelashes and eyebrows in black and lips in red. He left the mask next to the body to leave the police impressed and intrigued. He then drove Dolores' car back to her house, cleaned the vehicle to eliminate any traces, threw the car keys over the roof, and walked to the church, where he had left his own car. From there, he drove back to the camp lake, joining the group with the supplies he had supposedly just gone out to buy. The next day, around noon, a friend arrived at Dolores's house. Seeing the shattered glass door and no sign of Dolores, he picked up the phone and froze at the sight of the cut cord. Rushing to a payphone, he called emergency services. By that afternoon, the police had organized a search party, combing through roads and rural areas around the region. Going door to door, they sought out witnesses and information. Investigators quickly realized this was no ordinary missing person case. Along with the concrete block and severed phone line, they noted that Dolores's bedsheets were missing, and her shoes and undergarments had been disturbed. The days following Dolores's disappearance were devoted to an extensive search throughout the region. Then, 13 days later, on February 1st, a teenager walking his dog along a deserted road noticed his dog bolt under a bridge and refused to come back. When the boy went to investigate, he discovered a bedspread covering a body, frozen by the harsh winter temperatures. Next to the body lay a plastic mask, painted by hand. Horrified, the boy ran to notify the authorities. One of the detectives soon noticed the similarities between that case and that of Maureen Hedge, which had occurred 6 years earlier. Both victims had been tied up and strangled, their bodies removed from their homes, and their phone lines cut. These characteristics echoed the BTK crimes, but once again, there were also significant differences. The Park City victims, Maureen and Dolores, were older women and had been removed from their homes. BTK hadn't done that to the Wichita victims. Therefore, the investigators assumed that the cases of Maureen and Dolores could be linked to each other, but not to the other cases attributed to BTK. In May 1991, 4 months after Dolores's murder, Dennis Rader changed jobs. He was hired by Park City as a compliance officer, a role that involved collecting stray dogs, enforcing municipal rules, and issuing fines. He reveled in this newfound power, often taking a domineering and authoritarian approach with residents. For example, he would enter the front yard of a residence without asking permission, measure the height of the grass with a ruler, and become irritated if it was even a millimeter above the regulatory standard. When a pet ran away, he immediately took it in and often ordered it to be euthanized, without giving its owners enough time to rescue it. In just a few months in his new role, BTK had already aroused the dislike of several Park City residents who considered him arrogant, abusive, and even frightening. This pleasurable exercise of superiority and control over other individuals would keep his murderous impulses dormant for a few more years. In this case, long years. For over a decade, the X Factor remained dormant. By the early 2000s, BTK's crimes were fading from memory, a cold case from a bygone era. In Wichita, it was assumed his last crime had been in December 1977, with the murder of Nancy Fox. The community speculated he might have died or been arrested for an unrelated crime. Meanwhile, Dennis Rader continued to live an outwardly normal life with his wife and children, escaping justice entirely. In January 2004, the 30th anniversary of the Otero family murders arrived. The Eagle newspaper ran a retrospective on the crime, though it had lost the urgency and notoriety it once held. It was a routine followed by virtually every woman in Wichita in the late 1970s. When they get home, they checked their phone. If the line was dead, they should leave immediately. Today, people can't imagine the kind of tension that permeated Wichita back then. Although the murders remain clearly marked in the minds of those who experienced them, it is likely that many Wichita citizens know little or nothing about BTK. A law professor at a local college, for example, was surprised to find that none of his students expressed any reaction the moment he mentioned the BTK case. They had never even heard of that name. With so many years gone by, it's natural to assume that there might not even be a BTK anymore. Upon reading that report, BTK was completely mad, thinking people have assumed he was dead. He saw it as a personal affront he couldn't ignore. 13 years had passed since his last murder, and 30 since his first. He had evaded capture, eluded the police, and resisted the urge to boast publicly about his achievements. It was intolerable that his legacy had faded, that people no longer remembered his cunning or feared him. From now on, BTK was determined to unveil to the world everything he did and what he was capable of, now sharing the darkest and most sordid details that only he knew about. And it was this step he took, in search of new notoriety, which without realizing it, he left a crucial clue that ended up leading the police to discover who the real person behind BTK was. On March 19th, 2004, a white envelope arrived at the Eagle newspaper office. Inside was a single sheet of paper, along with photocopies of 3 Polaroid photos of a woman's body on the ground, and a driver's license bearing the name Vicki Wegerle. In the upper right corner of the paper, a strange symbol was hand-drawn, a sideways letter B designed to resemble breasts, with a T and K intertwined to look like arms and spread legs. The Eagle's veteran editor-in-chief, who had written about BTK many times before, was stunned and immediately contacted the police. Upon analysing the material, the new police commander quickly identified that those photographs were not police records of a crime scene. In each photo, the positions of the arms and legs were different. Police officers do not touch the bodies of victims at crime scenes. In other words, those photos were taken before the body was found. But there was an even more important fact that the correspondence seemed to reveal. Vicki Wegerle's unsolved homicide was being blamed on BTK, a possibility that had never been confirmed until now. After convincing the Eagle's editor to hold off on publishing details of this letter, the new police chief, Ken Landwehr, assembled a task force, resuming the work started by the original Ghostbusters team 2 decades prior. By cross-referencing the DNA samples obtained in the Otero and Wegerle cases, it was possible to confirm that Vicki's killer was the same man who killed the 4 Oteros. BTK's official list of crimes had just grown, and from all appearances, he was still alive and willing to communicate. Recognizing an opportunity, the police chief decided it was time to put a plan into action, communicating with BTK through the press, appealing to his ego and need for recognition, in the hope that he would eventually make the critical mistake that would reveal his identity. To support his strategy, the police chief reached out to the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit, requesting an agent with expertise in serial killer profiling to join the task force. The FBI analyst helped craft an intricate plan to draw BTK out through the media. In summary, the plan included publicly sharing information about BTK through press conferences. Such collectives should appear to be genuine, but their real purpose was direct communication with BTK. selecting a single spokesperson to lead all press conferences, giving BTK a face they could connect with. The designated police chief was Ken Landwehr, subtly implying that the police are making progress on the BTK case, despite loving the notoriety, didn't want to get caught. If he thought the police were about to capture him, he would be hesitant to attack again. Establishing a dedicated hotline to collect new leads, a channel through which he could perhaps get in touch. This plan needed to be executed with extreme caution, as the citizens of Wichita were about to learn the shocking truth: BTK was alive and still at large. On March 24, 2004, the Eagle newspaper website broke the story of the resurgence of the BTK monster. The print edition came out in the early hours of the following morning, with a disturbing headline and a short, thick introductory paragraph. The Wichita Eagle said, "Letter from serial killer BTK links him to a 1986 murder. A serial killer who terrorized Wichita in the 1970s by committing a series of 7 murders has claimed responsibility for an 8th death and is likely living in Wichita," police said this Wednesday. That same morning, Ken Landwehr appeared live on television to confirm the news at a press conference. Reporters from across the country pinpointed Wichita on their maps and rushed to cover the story. BTK was now a national sensation, a turn of events he hadn't anticipated, but precisely what the police had intended. A month and a half later, on May 4, 2004, a new envelope arrived at Cake TV containing a bizarre array of items. A homemade word search game, with terms that alluded to the disguises and modus operandi of the BTK murders, such as victim, fantasies, and stalking. Photocopies of 2 fake identity cards. Copy of a fake badge with the words Special Agent. A page containing 13 chapter titles for what was supposed to be a book titled The Story of BTK. Chapter 1 was named A Serial Killer is Born, and the name of the last chapter contained a very unsettling question: will there be more? Once again, the envelope bore no traceable genetic evidence. However, one critical objective was being met. BTK had taken the bait, responding to the police chief's subtle cues. To push him further, Chief Landwehr called another national press conference, where he publicly cast doubt on the authenticity of this latest communication. Another strategic move to provoke BTK and potentially lead him to make a revealing mistake. He announced that they were proceeding on the basis of the possibility that this letter did not actually come from BTK. As was known, people tried to impersonate others to confuse the police or attract attention. They had turned the material over to the FBI, and they would carry out a thorough analysis using the most advanced technologies in order to determine authenticity. Then, on January 5, 2006, Landwehr publicly revealed that a necklace belonging to Nancy Fox was missing after her murder. Police suspected that BTK might have stolen it and given it to a girlfriend at the time. A photo of Nancy wearing the necklace was released, and the police asked anyone with information to contact their hotline immediately. BTK watched with pride as the police chief discussed his crimes and how the police were making him the focus of the investigation. That ego massage of public acknowledgement was enough to make him want to communicate again. On January 8th, BTK drove his Jeep Cherokee to a large home improvement store in Wichita called Home Depot. He jumped out with a small box in his hands and walked towards a company vehicle. He placed the package in the truck bed, calmly returned to his car, and drove away. The truck's owner, a Home Depot employee, found the box later that day. On it were the words, bomb and BTK. Curious, he opened it to find a cereal box containing a necklace and several printed pages detailing BTK's life and crimes. But the most surprising item was a small note on a separate slip of paper. It said, "Can I communicate with Floppy and not be traced to a computer? Be honest. Under miscellaneous section 494, Rex, it will be okay. Run it for a few days in case I'm out of town, etc. I will try a Floppy for a test sometime in the near future. February or March." Detectives were shocked by the note. Did he really think they wouldn't be able to track a floppy disk? Was BTK this naive, or was he setting a trap? An internal debate ensued within the team about whether or not they should take the bait. Meanwhile, other police officers worked on analysing the videos, recorded by the Home Depot store's security cameras. Detectives were able to clearly identify the movements of a man who approached a vehicle with a white package in his hands and deposited it in the truck bed. There was no doubt that this man was BTK. However, the images were of poor quality and did nothing to help visualize the suspect's physical characteristics. But the police were finally able to obtain very convincing evidence. BTK was driving a Jeep Cherokee. In parallel, there was great hope that it would be possible to speed up the location of the BTK if it fulfilled its intention of communicating via a floppy disk. They then decided to play the game that BTK started, and for 7 consecutive days, the message, "Rex, everything will be fine," was published. 2 weeks later, on February 16, 2005, KSAS-TV, another Fox-affiliated Wichita TV station, received a suspicious envelope, protected with bubble wrap. Inside the envelope was a gold chain with a pendant, 3 lined pages recounting the details about the murder of the owner of that necklace, as well as instructions on how the police should do to contact BTK again. There was also a purple floppy disk, which was the most crucial item. The floppy disk contained a single file with the following message: "This is a test. See the attached sheet for details on how to communicate with me via the newspaper." However, the police were not that interested in the message itself. Forensic experts immediately began analysing the floppy disk. What they found was astonishingly simple. By clicking on the file's properties, they uncovered 2 pieces of critical information: the name Dennis and the fact that the disk had last been used on a computer registered to Christ Lutheran Church in Park City. A quick online search for the Lutheran Church revealed the name and photo of its congregation president, Dennis Rader. Another quick search of official personal registration systems led to Dennis Rader's home address, also in Park City. 2 detectives were immediately sent to canvass Dennis's address, and they could hardly believe it when they saw a Jeep Cherokee parked in front of the house. For the detectives, it was the end of the hunt, and they wanted to knock on BTK's door and arrest him right then and there. They contacted Chief Ken Landwehr with the good news, but he ordered them back to the station, cautioning that the arrest had to be executed perfectly. They still needed one final piece of irrefutable evidence: a DNA match to the genetic material from the BTK crime scenes. To secure irrefutable DNA evidence, the police chief devised a careful strategy. Rather than confronting the suspect directly, which could lead to undesirable consequences, they planned to obtain a DNA sample from a close relative of Dennis Rader and compare it to the BTK crime scene samples. Public records indicated that Dennis had a daughter, Kerry, who had attended Kansas State University in Manhattan, where students underwent regular medical examinations. With a court order, officers accessed Kerry's medical history at the university's medical center. They used preserved gynecological exam slides to obtain Kerry's genetic material. 2 days later, the police got the confirmation they had been longing for. The DNA was compatible with that of the serial killer who had managed to get away with it for 30 years. Dennis Rader was BTK. But the celebration wouldn't last long. Chief Ken Landwehr reminded the team that everyone needed to prepare meticulously for the operation that would lead to Dennis Rader's arrest. Task force officers spent the whole night planning a completely secretive and error-proof approach. On the morning of February 25, 2005, a pair of uniformed police officers were positioned close to the street where BTK lived, simulating a type of checkpoint. Other teams of plainclothes police were in strategic locations with unmarked vehicles. Everyone was waiting for BTK, who followed the same routine every day. He left work to have lunch at home, driving the Park City Hall's white pickup truck. At 12:15 p.m., as BTK passed by, the officers activated their siren. The good citizen pulled over as instructed. Instantly, more police vehicles appeared, blocking him from all sides. Within moments, officers had their weapons trained on him. BTK did not show any reaction. He wasn't scared. He didn't ask the questions that people would normally ask in a situation like this, such as, "What is this? What did I do?" He seemed resigned and, in a way, arrogant. The officers handcuffed him and lifted him off the ground. Then BTK looked right into the eyes of one of them and said, coldly and petulantly, to call his wife because she was expecting him for lunch. The police officers took BTK to the vehicle that would take him to the secret location where he would be interrogated. Inside the car, a very familiar face was waiting for him in the back seat, Chief Ken Landwehr. Upon arrival at the interrogation site, the first step was to collect a DNA sample to conclusively match him to the forensic evidence. Landwehr and an FBI profiler initiated the interrogation, adopting a friendly, respectful tone to put Rader at ease and encourage him to confess. They created an atmosphere that felt more like an informal chat between friends. In the first few hours, BTK dodged more direct questions and gave long, boring answers about his tedious life. Until, about 3 hours later, the police chief asked the critical question for the long-awaited confession. Placing the floppy disk on the table, Landwehr explained that BTK had sent it, and their IT experts had traced it to Christ Lutheran Church and to him. Looking directly at Dennis, Landwehr asked if he had anything he wanted to share about that. Dennis Than said, "I think you already have the answer. There's no way I can get out of this. You got me, guys. I'm BTK." BTK began to cooperate fully with investigators, sharing meticulous details of each crime in a proud yet detached manner, as if recounting mundane tasks. It was during this confession that police learned for the first time that the unsolved murders of Maureen Hedge and Dolores Davis were also BTK's work. He facilitated the police's work in obtaining evidence about crimes. He sketched a floor plan of his house, indicating the hidden compartments he kept in each room to store the items he stole from his victims like trophies, in addition to the extensive pages he had written, documenting the details of each of his murder projects. The police arrived at his house with search and seizure warrants. When told that her husband had been a serial killer for decades, Paula Dietz refused to believe it. Officers reassured and tried to calm her down, saying that they had already gathered indisputable evidence against him, and that they were only there to comply with the court order and search the house, his office at City Hall, the municipal library, and the headquarters of the Lutheran Church. Along with his macabre collection, the police found several Polaroid photos of his victims and of BTK himself, tied up and wearing women's clothing, wigs and masks during his autoerotic rituals. He also indicated a location in his City Hall office, where he stored binders and folders with reports on his crimes, as well as weapons and other items from his attack kit. On the morning of Saturday, February 26, 2005, representatives from several national press outlets gathered to hear Chief Ken Landwehr make the announcement.
Agents from the KBI, agents from the FBI, members of the Wichita Police Department arrested Dennis Rader, 59, a white male, in Park City, Kansas, for the murders of Joseph Otero, Julie Otero, Josephine Otero, Joseph Otero Jr., Catherine Bright, Shirley Vian Relford, Nancy Fox, and Vicki Wegerle. He was arrested for first-degree murder of all those victims. He's being held at this time in an undisclosed location. We will be approaching the district attorney's office next week, reference charges, to see if charges will be filed against this individual. I thank you very much for your support, and I'll turn it back over to Chief Williams.
The preliminary hearing for BTK took place on June 27, 2005, attracting extensive national and international media coverage. Television stations worldwide broadcast his chilling confession, where, in a disturbingly calm and unfeeling tone, he detailed each murder. Responding to the judge's requests for specifics, he described the horrifying acts as if they were routine. Finally, the judge accepted his guilty plea for 10 murders, holding him in custody until sentencing. On August 17, 2005, the BTK sentencing hearing began, with wide media coverage. All police officers involved in the task force were interviewed and narrated the terrifying details of the criminal's statements and posture during interrogations. Family members of the victims were present, delivering impact statements that revealed the lasting anguish caused by his actions, and rightly condemning him with words reserved for the worst of criminals. After 2 days of statements, BTK himself would also have the right to make his final statement. As soon as he began to speak, every family member of the victims present left the courtroom, as they refused to hear any allegations of the monster that destroyed their families. BTK gave a pathetic, gibberish speech, rambling on for 20 minutes, as if he was on some kind of red carpet to receive an award. He compared his victims to himself, trying to humanize himself. In the end, he talked about regret, but only as a concept, not something he felt. And he ended with a biblical quote which seemed disconnected from any meaning with his speech. Then, it was time for the judge to deliver the sentence. On August 18, 2005, BTK was sentenced to 10 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole, the maximum penalty available. The self-proclaimed criminal mastermind, who saw himself as a figure of superior intelligence, was now condemned to a life of isolation. He would spend the rest of his days alone, unseen, unheard, and no longer feared. BTK not only destroyed the families of his victims, but also his own family, for whom he showed such devotion. Paula Dietz, his wife, got an emergency divorce shortly after her husband's arrest. Dennis Rader is currently 80 years old and still serving his life sentence in solitary confinement in the National Prison. He is alone in a small individual cell. He rarely ventures out for the 1 hour of sunbathing outdoor time. He is entitled to because he is afraid of giving other prisoners the opportunity to attack him, since inside he is called a molester. The penitentiary is aware of what could happen to him, and that is why they try their best to protect him. Because of this, he is always accompanied by guards when he needs to be consulted by prison doctors, and receives practically all his meals in his own cell.